One of the most impactful shows ever made concluded roughly 5 years ago with a whopping 73 episodes. Since so much time has passed since the conclusion of this series, I wanted to go back to each one of the 73 episodes and rank them from worst to best. What is my criteria for this ranking? Simply how much I enjoyed the episodes. That's it. Now, as great as this show was, we gotta start the list somewhere. Number 73. The Iron Throne. I really struggled between which of two episodes should be number 73 on this list, but as bad as some of the episodes are, I just think the finale has to be the worst of them all. Of course, there is a lot to complain about, but the scene that actively makes me depressed is the scene at the end with the Dragon Pit, where the Lords of Westeros discuss the future of the Seven Kingdoms. I am of the belief that stories should have a thematic resolution. You can subvert expectations or follow traditional narrative tropes as long as there is a thematic resolution, I'll be happy. Game of Thrones was a series where lords and ladies of royal houses fought over power. The plights of a few dozen people led to the deaths of millions of people. As bad as some of the decisions in season 8 are, it honestly would have been partially saved for me if there was a proper resolution, a proper acknowledgement of the past few decades and how to prevent that in the future. The writers attempted to do this by having the king be chosen by a group of lords and ladies rather than be by a bloodline, but that is not enough. There is still a king. People will still fight for power. Wars will still be fought over power. I don't care that Bran was chosen to be king. I do care how he became king, and I don't find that to be enough of a thematic resolution. Yeah, I could complain about other parts of the episode. Daenerys' death was fairly anticlimactic. The ending for each of the Starks was somewhat fitting, I suppose, and hey, the speech given by Daenerys was kinda cool. But overall, the writer's inability to provide a satisfying thematic resolution is what disappoints me so much and makes this episode the last on my list. Number 72. The Long Night. Speaking of thematic resolutions, there was absolutely no kind of resolution with the Army of the Dead. The White Walkers were a threat established in the literal first scene of the show. The threat of the Walkers had been built up for almost every single episode. This is the episode that would be the culmination of that. And what was the resolution of it all? Arya was able to sneak up on the Night King and kill him. Was there any thematic relevance of these royal houses bickering for power while an existential threat marches on the country? No. Was there any relevance to all the prophecies and chosen ones named throughout the show? No. Was there any significance to Bran and his relationship with the Night King? No. He just held memories and that's why he must die. Even House of the Dragon has doubled down on the importance of the war against the dead, thus making this episode even more frustrating. There was arguably more buildup to this battle than there was for who would sit on the Iron Throne, and all of that buildup went nowhere. Now, I could excuse all these disappointing payoffs if the battle was actually fun to watch. There are movies and shows I don't like, but I can at least somewhat enjoy them because of how well filmed the action was. Not The Long Night! Two parts of this battle infuriate me. One part is, of course, the lighting of this battle. I don't care that it's realistic that no one would be able to see. I don't care if it makes sense that the Night King would do this. I want to see a well-lit battle so the action is clear. This episode, you can't see shit. Not once have I wanted to go on YouTube and rewatch moments from this battle, because none of it is pleasing to watch. The only part of this battle that is rewatchable is the part where the Night King dies, and that is only because of the amazing score. The strategy behind this battle is as nonsensical as everyone says it is, so to see how dumb the battle plan was here makes me depressed. I believe this battle is still technically the longest battle ever put to screen, and that is such a shame because of how terrible it is. Number 71. The Last of the Starks. What frustrates me the most about this episode is all the idiotic character decisions made to force the story into the direction it needs to go for the final two episodes. Of course, there is Daenerys forgetting about the Iron Fleet. We all know how silly that is. The whole situation around Jon's parents and him having to tell everyone was so infuriating. I get that Jon is this honorable guy and telling his family is the right thing to do, but I just wish it crossed Jon's mind once why his father, or Ned Stark, lied kind to everyone, including Jon. This episode also does something that I hate so much, and that is cut away from what would be a powerful scene. Jon tells Arya and Sansa about his family off screen. Why? Because it's a supposed repeat of Sam telling Jon and Jon telling Daenerys? I don't care. Seeing character reactions is so important, so don't rob it of us. The other parts of this episode that frustrates me so much is how it shrunk the world. Beyond the Wall is the only episode in the series that rivals this episode in terms of time travel and information crossing Westeros in a matter of minutes. In this episode, Daenerys travels from Winterfell to Dragonstone where Rhaegal is killed and Missandei is captured. Then this information makes it all the way back north so Jaime can hear it, where he decides to betray everything his arc represented to go back to Cersei. I hate this part of the later seasons, and it is very prevalent here. I don't mind the ending scene at least, even though Tyrion is an idiot for still trying to convince Cersei for peace. I like the tension of the scene. Overall, this episode was as frustrating as it was stupid, not even making the top 70 of a 73 episode series. Number 70. Unbowed, Unbent, Unbroken. This episode is a mix of boring shit along with stupid shit. A good portion of this episode is Arya and Braavos just cleaning floors. The Faceless Men stuff is interesting at times, but not so much in this episode. Part of this episode features Cersei and Olenna chatting about the Faith Militant and their imprisonment of Loras. I have a lot to say about the Faith Militant stuff, so stay tuned for that. But in short, I don't like it all that much. We also spend a fair amount of time in Dorne with the Sand Snakes. Sure, it is cool to see Dorne, but we can all at least agree how uninteresting this whole arc was, and this episode certainly is a part of that. But of course, the major reason this episode is so low on this list is because of the rape of Sansa. If you watched my Game of Thrones Season 8 5 years later video, you would know why the whole Sansa and Ramsay part of the story frustrates me so much. I don't think her being abused and tortured by Ramsay adds anything to Sansa's arc. Her arc was not about being abused and seeking justice for it. It was about her taking agency with her life and learning how to play the Game of Thrones. So having Ramsay rape Sansa was just so unnecessary and pretty gratuitous. The only part of this episode I enjoyed were the conversations between Tyrion and Jorah. Besides that, this episode was mostly boring and partially insulting. Number 69. Beyond the Wall. A lot of people point to moments throughout the series where they felt the show went off the rails. Some people say it was the first episode of season 5, some say it was the first episode of season 7. I point to this episode as the episode where Game of Thrones stopped being Game of Thrones. Sure, a good portion of the episodes between the beginning of season 5 and this episode weren't great, but at least they were still kinda Game of Thrones, just of lesser quality. This episode really felt like a Marvel movie, and not in a good way. Jon and a collection of characters from all corners of the show travel together north to capture a white. We all know how stupid this plan was. It was frankly infuriatingly stupid, but that's not what pisses me off the most. Sure, this episode features some of the worst examples of time travel in the show, where Gendry is able to sprint for a whole day to send a raven back to Daenerys so she can fly halfway across the country to save Jon. That was bad. But what really pissed me off was the action. Game of Thrones was known for having no plot armor. People suffered the realistic consequences of their actions. In this episode, most of our main characters are fighting hundreds of zombies and all the important characters survive. Having Jon fall into water this far north and make the trek back to the wall and not die of hypothermia was ridiculous. I hate everything about this journey beyond the wall. The whole drama between Arya and Sansa also did this episode no favors. This episode featured so many frustrating plot points that it has to be this low on my list. Number 68. Eastwatch. This episode features characters acting in a way that drives me up walls with how frustrating it is. In one half, we see the conflict between Arya and Sansa. I don't like to use the word forced or contrived too often, but the conflict between Arya and Sansa was forced and contrived. It just seems like Arya is out for Sansa and is trying to find any reason to cause drama. But later on, we are supposed to believe that these scenes were all fake to trick Littlefinger. I just don't know if these conversations between Sansa and Arya were real or not. The other half of this episode features Tyrion coming up with a plan to steal a white to convince Cersei to help with the battle in the north. Yes, I just mentioned how stupid this plan was, but what frustrates me more is Tyrion thinking they need Cersei's help and thinking she would help him. Cersei actually makes this point in the season 7 finale. If 3 dragons isn't enough to stop the army of the dead, then a few thousand soldiers isn't going to help. And again, why does Tyrion have so much faith in Cersei? So frustrating. The only good parts of this episode was Sam at the Citadel, kinda, and a few of the conversations between Daenerys and Jon Snow. Number 67. The Bells. Now, I'm assuming a lot of you are questioning how the Bells can be so high on my list, even if it's still 67 out of 73. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. This episode is responsible for some of the worst character assassinations I have ever seen. The events that led up to Daenerys burning down King's Landing are inexcusable. I don't care how many people point to events throughout the 8 seasons where Daenerys was mildly cruel. She would never, and I mean never, burn down a city of mostly innocent people after they had all surrendered. The battle was over and Daenerys decided to commit mass murder just for fun. On the other hand, we have the assassination of Jaime. The conversation he has with Tyrion just breaks my heart. Hearing him say he doesn't care for innocent people just makes me cry. The reason this episode is so frustrating to watch is because of the decisions the writers wanted the characters to make and how poorly set up those decisions were. I cannot emphasize enough how damaging the decisions made in this episode were, and I totally understand why people would say this episode is the worst in the series because of that. So why is this episode so high on my list? Well, I think the execution of this terrible script was actually done excellently. I really liked the tension spreading in the episode after Daenerys decides to go mad. Seeing Arya have to run around while giving us a perspective from the ground I thought was actually a really wise choice. There's also just something about the subversion of Daenerys' forces becoming the villains that I kinda liked. Again, I will never excuse the writing decisions that led to the events in this episode, but if you asked me how I'd want to see a god-awful script portrayed on screen, I would want it like this episode. Number 66. Sons of the Harpy. This episode is basically a slightly better version of Unbowed, Unbent, Unbroken. In that episode, we spent a good amount of time in Dorne, and here we get more of that. This is also the episode where we are introduced to everyone's favorite bastards of Dorne, the Sand Snakes. I like the concept of this arc, it just wasn't as captivating as I would have hoped. This episode features some politicking in King's Landing. Now, this is a completely unfair criticism, but watching small council scenes without Tywin just doesn't compare to the scenes with Tywin. He was my favorite character in the show, and his absence in these scenes is certainly felt. This episode also features the High Sparrow arresting Loras for being gay in one of the more frustrating scenes in the show. The whole Faith Militant and the High Sparrow arc frustrates me to no end. This episode also features the death of another one of my favorite characters, Barristan Selmy. Yeah, the fight scene itself was pretty cool and well choreographed, but I was always frustrated with the decision to kill Barristan off this way. I don't think it benefited the story at all. Overall, this episode highlighted the parts of the show I disliked the most and killed off one of my favorite characters. Number 65. The Nightlands. Here we have the first episode from the first 4 seasons to show up on the list, and I'll be honest, I don't have many negative things to say, but I don't have any positive things either. We're probably at that point on the list where the episodes stop offending me and are either just boring or not as good as other episodes, which says a lot about how good this show is. Filler wouldn't be the right word to use to describe this episode. It's more of a setup episode. It sets up some weird magic stuff with Stannis, which is okay. There's some conflict out east with Daenerys and her people struggling to survive. This is also the episode where Theon returns home for the first time and fingers his sister, which was pretty gross. There's decent conversations with Arya on the King's Road and Jon up north. The best part of this episode is Tyrion verbally torching Janos Slynt and the revelation that Joffrey was the one who had all of Robert's bastards killed. Besides those few entertaining scenes, again, this episode is mostly just set up for the conflict shown in season 2. Nothing here offended me, but very little entertained or intrigued me. Number 64. The House of Black and White. This episode reminds me how the first half of season 5 is really not that good. Like the previous episode I mentioned, this is another setup episode, except it sets up storylines that I actively dislike. In Braavos, we have Arya wandering the streets until she is finally allowed entry into the House of Black and White, a storyline I dislike. This episode shows Sansa and Peter on their way to Winterfell, a storyline I dislike. Now, the more prominent part of this episode is setting up the Dorne storyline. Cersei gets a threat from Ellaria about hurting Marcella. This leads to a story I dislike. The only part of this episode that set up a storyline that I didn't dislike was what's going on up north with Jon. Here we have some pretty cool conversations between Jon and Stannis, where Jon is offered lordship of Winterfell. He declines, which says a lot about his character. Then we get the scene where Jon is elected Lord Commander, and that was a wholesome scene. So I really liked the setup for Jon's story, but everything else in this episode I didn't care for. Number 63. Winterfell. This episode, like the Nightlands and the House of Black and White, is mostly a setup episode, and the things it paid off didn't really amount to much. On the payoff front, we have Theon rescuing Yara, which was surprisingly quick. We also have the payoff of the introduction of the Golden Company, who were lacking the elephants I know we all wanted to see. Now, what did this episode set up? Things that went nowhere. At Last Hearth, Tormund and Beric and some others come across a bunch of dead bodies laid in the symbol we have seen all series. What did this amount to? Nothing. Now, most of the episode takes place in Winterfell. And yeah, most of the setup here went nowhere, but I kinda enjoyed seeing all these combinations of characters. We have some reunions between Jon and Bran along with Jon and Arya. Those were fun scenes to watch. The scene where Daenerys tells Sam that she executed his father and brother was surprisingly powerful. The highlight of this episode is Sam telling Jon the truth about his parents. I thought it was done alright. This episode again was just set up, but it had a lot of little moments that I enjoyed. So even though it's part of the widely hated Season 8, it wasn't that bad, to be honest. Number 62, Kill the Boy. Another episode from the first half of Season 5. You guys should probably notice the pattern that I didn't really like in Season 5. This episode features 3 distinct parts. One I kinda like and the other 2 I don't. So the part I like is everything with Jon up north. He is now Lord Commander and he is looking for advice from Aemon. I've always loved the scenes between these two, so I don't mind seeing more here. And then we get to see what kind of leader Jon is, where he frees Tormund, and this is frankly a big moment for the series. Slightly down south, we have Sansa spending some time in Winterfell. And this whole arc frustrates me because I don't think it's progressing Sansa's story in the way that it should. Sansa's just getting tormented along with Theon. The reunion between her and Theon was interesting, I suppose, which did set up a powerful relationship the two have later on. And then out east, the conflict between Daenerys and the people of Meereen is starting to ramp up. I wouldn't say I hate this part of the story, I don't love it though. I wasn't too intrigued with the politics of Meereen and often kept telling myself I just wish Daenerys would travel west to go to Westeros finally. This episode highlighted some parts of the show I liked and some parts I didn't care for at all. Number 61, The Red Woman. This episode has a lot going on in it. In some ways, it is a setup episode, but it sets up a lot way too quickly in my opinion. So there's a bunch of plot lines going on with the Dornish. Jaime returns home with a dead Myrcella, and this adds to Cersei's torment. Some of the wackiest stuff of this episode is that it turns out Ellaria was actually planning a coup of Dorne this whole time, which frankly came out of nowhere. This also leads to some of the other Sand Snakes killing Prince Trystane, which was also rather shocking. All the way in Essos, a bunch is happening too. Arya is blinded and is forced to beg in the streets, along with learning to fight blind with the Waif. You guys know I don't love this arc, so not much changes here. With the Daenerys stuff, we see her reintroduced to the Dothraki, while Tyrion and the others try to hold down Meereen. I do like the stuff with the Dothraki, but I still don't care for the Meereenese. And just like always, the stuff up north is the most interesting. Seeing factions within the Night's Watch form, those who are loyal to Jon and those who aren't, was something I enjoyed. Yeah, this episode continues some stuff I don't like, and yes, it continues stuff I do like, but overall this episode is trying to do too much too quickly. Number 60, Dragonstone. I have a little bit of a secret. Even though I totally acknowledge a lot of Season 7 stinks, I actually kinda enjoy a lot of it. Season 7 features a lot of characters uniting and reuniting, and these interactions drive the season for me. The season also is a lot more streamlined than the previous one, so there's less going on, and I actually like that. Cersei is now Queen of Westeros, and she prepares to go to war with Daenerys. Jon is now King in the North, and we continue to see how Jon thrives in leadership positions. We get some stuff with Bran finally returning to the Wall, and I don't care for this because Bran's story goes nowhere and he's basically an emotionless alien by this point. There's some solid moments with the Hound too, as he returns back to that house that he and Arya stopped by way back when. Speaking of Arya, we see her kill the entire Frey family. Yeah, it felt good seeing House Stark get their justice, but if you watched my Game of Thrones 5 years later video, you would know this scene didn't thrill me. The highlight of this episode was Daenerys arriving at Dragonstone. I just remember being so excited that the real war for the Iron Throne was finally starting. Daenerys was finally done meandering out east, and she returned to Westeros. And I like how it teases the wars to come. This was a solid start to the season, with some highlights sprinkled throughout. Number 59, Breaker of Chains. A majority of this episode is the aftermath of Joffrey's death, and while it certainly doesn't live up to that episode, a lot here was still pretty entertaining. I liked seeing all the different people in King's Landing try and figure out what really happened. Tyrion is arrested, of course, and he gets some visits. Tywin does some detective work, suspecting Oberyn for being involved. Sansa has escaped, and we see the beginning of her arc with Littlefinger, something which was a good watch in this season at least. Again, none of this stuff was too eventful, but it was really interesting to see how things started to change. A lot is going on up north. Wildlings attack northern villages, where we meet Ollie. Jon plans a trip beyond the wall to Craster's Keep to prevent Mance from learning the truth about how many people really are at Castle Black. With Daenerys out east, we get the scene where Daario fights for Daenerys outside of Meereen, and I've always loved that scene. This episode could have been much better, but what really brings it down for me was the completely unnecessary scene where Jaime rapes Cersei. This moment just feels so out of place in Jaime's story, and a lot of people seem to just pretend it never happened, and I don't blame them. This was overall a solid episode dragged down by one really bad moment. Number 58, The Broken Man. There's a lot going on here as storylines begin to reach their climax in Season 6. Even though the stuff with the Faith Militant infuriates me, I love seeing all of Cersei's plans crumble around her. Olenna was totally right in blaming Cersei for what happened. This episode is also the episode where Marjorie and Olenna have their last conversation, I believe. They had one of the best relationships, so it was bittersweet knowing this is the last time they will talk. Up north, we see Jon and Sansa recruiting for the Battle of the Bastards. This was the part of Game of Thrones I always liked, the planning and the scheming. So while it's not as engaging as it was in the earlier seasons, I do like seeing Jon trying to recruit the other northern lords. The Hound is revealed to be alive, something that was nice, I guess. My favorite part of the episode was Jaime in the Riverlands and his conversation with the Blackfish. Before it was destroyed in Season 8, Jaime's arc was one of my favorites, and the way he handles the Riverlands conflict was one of my favorite parts of that arc. At this point in the ranking, we are reaching episodes that I like for the most part. I just don't love them. Number 57, Valar Dohaeris. The beginning of Season 3 features new characters and new situations, and we see said characters navigating those situations. Up north, Jon is introduced to most of the Wildlings, where we meet Tormund for the first time, and we also meet Mance Rayder. The Tyrells are now in King's Landing, and we see how Marjorie navigates her new relationship with the Lannisters. The contrast of the harmony of the Tyrell family and the constant infighting of the Lannisters is so funny to me. The beginning of the downfall of Tyrion starts to play out, as he is given no credit for winning the Battle of the Blackwater. And lastly, a good portion of this episode surrounds Davos and the fallout of the Battle of the Blackwater. Seeing Stannis so defeated and Davos's frustration with Melisandre was some fairly intriguing drama. Again, nothing too eventful happens in this episode, but it does set up future storylines really nicely. Not every episode needs to have major events going on, but more likely than not, these kinds of episodes won't be as entertaining as the episodes with major events. Number 56, No One. The most prominent part of this episode is Arya finally getting the hell out of Braavos. Even though so much of this chase scene and fight is ridiculous, I can't help but somewhat enjoy it because most of this arc has been so damn boring. This moment where Arya supposedly completes her arc could have been nice if it wasn't ruined in later episodes. There's a good amount of High Sparrow in this episode, which I don't like, but I do like the scenes where Cersei repeatedly tells them all to screw off. The scenes in Meereen are kinda boring, but I don't entirely hate the conversations Tyrion tries to have with Grey Worm and Missandei. The highlight of this episode is of course Jaime in the Riverlands. I love this part of Jaime's story, and seeing him negotiate the peaceful surrender of Riverrun was a great part of his arc. The conversation between Jaime and Edmure was a highlight too. Not much exciting happens in this episode, but I do love this stuff with Jaime. Oh, and the scenes with the Hound too were pretty funny. Number 55, Blood of My Blood. This episode is pretty boring if you ask me. A majority of the episode is devoted to stuff involving the Faith Militant. You guys know how much I hate those guys. Jaime gets dismissed from the King's Guard and tries to lead an attack against the Faith Militant, but fails because Tommen is so easily manipulated. But hey, at least we got more of Mace Tyrell. The reason this episode isn't a total bore, however, is because of two other scenes. Arya watching the play of Joffrey dying again was quite hilarious and well done, but the highlight is what happens down south with the Tarleys. I thought a lot of this was really well done, especially illustrating the relationship between Sam and his father. Makes you understand why Sam was so willing to join the Night's Watch all the way back in Season 1. It was sad to watch, but it was really well done regardless. Most of this episode was Faith Militant filth, but there are a few other great moments to ease the pain of this episode. Number 54, High Sparrow. Fuck this guy, man. This episode introduces us to the High Sparrow, and you know I don't like him. So that's the reason to dislike this episode. This episode is also the episode where Sansa gets shipped off to the Boltons in one of the more frustrating parts of the show. Sansa's story in season 5 is all about her being tortured and forgiving Theon. And while I do like the latter, I don't like the former. So yeah, there are parts of this episode that certainly stink, but there are some parts that are great. This conversation between Cersei and Marjorie is one of my favorites. The way Marjorie is able to roast Cersei is just perfect, and it makes me chuckle. This episode also features the wedding between Tommen and Marjorie, but of course the highlight is what's going on up north. Now that he is Lord Commander, I love seeing Jon use his power for once to execute the prick Janos Slynt. It was a badass moment for Jon, and I loved it. This episode certainly has some lows, but it definitely has some highs too. Number 53, The Gift. There's lots of Dorne in this episode. Yay. Bronn is in prison and gets to spend a lot of time with everyone's favorite sand snakes. Jaime argues with Myrcella about where she should be, and frankly, I don't blame Jaime for wanting to leave Dorne. The place sucks. This is the episode out east where Daenerys finally meets Tyrion. We don't get to see any real reaction because the episode ends right then and there, but hey, it's still a pretty cool moment to see. Up north, we get a lot of setup for some pretty powerful moments. Jon and Tormund leave for Hardhome, which we all know is really bonkers. Stannis is approached with the idea of burning Shireen alive. While he initially refuses, it is nice to see how desperate Stannis is becoming and how he is running out of options. The highlight of this episode is what goes on with Sam and Aemon. Ghost makes an appearance to save Gilly and Sam, and the death of Maester Aemon was really powerful. If Dorne wasn't a part of this episode, I would certainly enjoy it a lot more. Number 52, Book of the Stranger. The majority of this episode highlights the goddamn High Sparrow and his annoying ass stories. That's the majority of the reason why this episode is so low on my list, because this dude has way too much screen time. The other moments in this episode aren't too shabby. Jon gets reunited with Sansa, and this is maybe the first big reunion we've gotten in the show, and I thought it worked really well. There's some other politics going on at Castle Black, especially in regards to how they will handle the Boltons. Out east, there's stuff with Daenerys and the Dothraki, and I thought a lot of that was awesome. And no, not because Daenerys stood topless right in front of the screen. This was just such a powerful moment for Daenerys. It reminds me of how she continues to grow even this late in the series. This episode has aspects to it I really like, but a lot that I don't like. Number 51, Stormborn. What pisses me off a lot about this episode is that I quite enjoy it, but it is totally ruined by the remaining episodes of the season. A big focus of this episode is Daenerys beginning her campaign in Westeros. Dany's downfall can be pinned to the moment she meets Melisandre. There's a bunch of talk about who the chosen one could be. It could be Daenerys, it could be Jon Snow, who knows? But none of this matters in the end because there was no prince who was promised, and if there was, I guess it was Arya. This is the episode where Daenerys is convinced to summon Jon Snow, which is the event that begins her downfall. Nothing here matters at all in the long run other than to drive Daenerys crazy. Shocker. This episode also shows Arya finding Nymeria again, which, while a good moment, didn't matter at all. There's some drama up north with Jon and Littlefinger that isn't too important. There's a battle with the Greyjoys, which was kinda cool, and then some politics in King's Landing with Randall Tarley, which was only relevant so he could die later on to drive Daenerys mad. This episode has a lot of solid moments that either amount to nothing or only exist to drive Daenerys crazy. Number 50, The Bear and the Maiden Fair. This episode covers a lot of different story arcs, and they almost all center around love in some respect. Up north, Jon is now part of a love triangle with Ygritte and Orell, although that doesn't last too long. Sansa talks to Marjorie about her new marriage, and I guess her lack of love for Tyrion. Talisa reveals to Robb that she is pregnant, which is a touching moment if you don't know what would come 2 episodes later. The highlight of this episode is probably the relationship between Jaime and Brienne. Seeing Jaime go back for her while he was set free is a great progression of his arc, and the episode ends with Brienne fighting a bear. This episode was one of the 4 that was written by George R.R. Martin, and I can see why. Love is a complicated thing, and who better to write these scenes than the person who created these characters? If you're really into the romance part of the show, this episode is for you. It isn't a big part of my love for the show, so this episode falls somewhere around the middle of my list. Number 49, The Wars to Come. This episode sets the stage for most of the players and conflicts during Season 5, and while a lot of it isn't bad, it sets the stage for some issues to come. The episode begins with Cersei's childhood when she hears about the prophecy. What's frustrating about this scene is that I love its inclusion in the show, but it's barely mentioned again for the rest of the series, so I kinda question why it was put here in the first place. We catch up with Tyrion, who is now in Essos, and again, while nothing here is bad per se, it didn't set up Tyrion's story in an interesting way going forward. There is more politics in King's Landing, which isn't as interesting anymore now that Tywin is dead. May he rest in peace. But just like a lot of these Season 5 episodes, the highlights are the events up north. This is the episode where Mance is executed, but I love how they turned this into a big moment for Jon, sparing Mance by killing him before he would burn. Upon first viewing, there is nothing wrong with this episode, but if you really look closely, you can start to see the cracks. Number 48. The Prince of Winterfell. In these first 6 seasons, usually episode 9 of the season is a big episode, so episode 8 is thus mostly a setup episode, but these episodes are still pretty good. Tyrion is a standout in this episode. The scenes of him planning for the siege with Bronn and Varys are not only entertaining, but also insightful. I love the scene where Cersei thinks she's outsmarted Tyrion by capturing his whore. I get so much joy in seeing Cersei think she's smart when she really isn't. We also get some solid moments with Stannis and Davos, like Stannis naming Davos' hand. At Harrenhal, we approach the conclusion of Arya's arc with Tywin. These scenes are some of the best in the show, so it was sad to see them go. We get some more development with Robb and Talisa, along with Jon and the Wildlings. This episode pretty much features every character in the show and does so nicely. It's just that since every character was highlighted, not many were allowed to shine, except for maybe Tyrion. This episode is the appetizer to the main course, and while you can certainly love an appetizer, it's usually not as good as the main course. Number 47. Dark Wings, Dark Words. Now that we're firmly in the top 50, we will be discussing the episodes I at least thoroughly enjoy. This episode continues to develop a lot of the plot lines in Season 3. It's incredible how great the scenes in King's Landing are in these first 4 seasons. We get some plotting with the Tyrells, along with Marjorie's manipulation of Joffrey. Marjorie was such a unique player in the Game of Thrones, so most of her scenes are great. Beyond the Wall, the arc with Jon and the Wildlings continues to develop nicely. While a lot of this stuff is certainly interesting at times, I do agree overall that Robb's story did stall just a little bit here. We get some interesting scenes with Arya and the Brotherhood. This is where the Hound calls out Arya, and of course we get the fight between Jaime and Brienne, but then Jaime is recognized. Some storylines stalled in this episode a bit, some progress nicely, but like a lot of episodes you're going to see in this portion of the list, it's just solid and nothing more. Number 46. The North Remembers. This episode was a slow but really good start to Season 2. The ending of Season 1 was so great, it's kinda hard to follow in its tracks. Tyrion is now Hand of the King, and the scenes of him are my favorite. I love Tyrion in Season 2. Seeing him play the Game of Thrones is some of my favorite parts of the show. Joffrey continues to be a little shit, no surprise there. After the triumphant moment of Daenerys hatching her dragons, the story slowly needs to continue on after that, with showing how she is struggling. Jon and his new brothers travel north, where we meet Craster for the first time. Some really solid stuff here, especially with Commander Mormont. And in the Riverlands, we get some great scenes between Robb and Jaime. Again, the ending of Season 1 was so great that this episode seems to be stuck in its shadow. But that by no means it's a bad episode. If anything, it's actually a really good start to Season 2. Number 45. The Queen's Justice. This episode has a lot that I quite like. So this is the episode where Jon Snow finally meets Daenerys. This conversation may have been one of the more anticipated ones up to this point for me. And while the dialogue is noticeably not as sharp as it was in the earlier seasons, I still really like the scene. A lot of Season 7 is just people talking on Dragonstone, and I don't entirely mind that all that much. Back in King's Landing, we got a few cringe-ass moments with Euron, especially the most classic moment of them all, but the scene where Cersei gets her revenge on Ellaria was really well done. It's one of the few times Cersei felt like Cersei these past few seasons. Some stuff up north happens that isn't too intriguing. Bran reunites with Sansa, and then he gets all creepy reminding Sansa of her rape. But the reason I enjoy this episode so much is mostly because of what happens on Dragonstone. Rewatching this episode, I find myself hopeful that some alternate universe exists where things don't go to shit, and this episode actually sets up some cool things. Number 44. Oathkeeper. This episode has a lot of solid moments for Jaime that I like. There's his conversation with Tyrion where the two continue to bond. The relationship between these two was one of my favorites. We also see Jaime for the first time really start to go on his honorable story arc by sending Brienne to find Sansa. The moment Brienne named the sword Oathkeeper was a really touching moment. Jaime also does some training with Bronn, which was funny. We see Marjorie work her magic on Tommen in a well-written scene. This episode also reveals to us who really killed Joffrey. It was a mix of Littlefinger and Olenna. Both were pretty solid scenes. Up north, we get some of the politics with the Night's Watch as Jon and the others begin to journey to Craster's. And yeah, there's stuff out east in Meereen, but no one really cares. This episode was a Jaime-focused episode, and as you guys can probably tell, Jaime-focused episodes are some of my favorite episodes in the series. Number 43. First of his name. This episode follows up the last episode we just discussed, and it covers so many parts of the story, but it does it pretty well. The highlight for me in this episode was the stuff going on in King's Landing, especially in regards to Cersei. Tommen gets crowned king, and Cersei has a really deep conversation with Marjorie, although Marjorie doesn't reciprocate. She also has a touching conversation with Oberyn. Season 4 shows Cersei beginning to lose her mind as she blames Tyrion for Joffrey's death, but these scenes serve to remind us of the little bit of humanity that still resides in Cersei. Traveling up north, we are reunited with Lysa Arryn as this gets the Eerie storyline going. Out east, Daenerys declares that she will stay in Meereen to better develop the skills necessary to be queen. This moment would be more impactful if the Meereen arc didn't turn out to be so boring, but I can't blame this episode for the future. There's also a conversation with Podrick and Brienne, which serves to better develop both characters. But another highlight is up north, where Jon journeys to Craster's Keep. That entire sequence was really well done. It's one of the few times I enjoyed Bran's story as well. This was a pretty solid episode that developed a lot of plot points nicely. Number 42. Garden of Bones. This episode does a wonderful job at showing how cruel and grotesque Game of Thrones is. Up north, Robb meets Talisa in the aftermath of a battle, and getting her insight into the war was surprisingly powerful, along with the moment of someone having to have his foot amputated. Maybe the most brutal part of this episode was the torture going on at Harrenhal. Seeing how the Lannister soldiers tortured these prisoners was definitely brutal, but then Tywin comes to save the day. This set up the Tywin and Arya storyline, which you guys know I think is brilliant. We get some other great scenes in the Stormlands involving the Baratheons. We get the only scene with Renly and Stannis in the entire series. A conversation beautifully written and quite funny. And speaking of grotesque stuff, we see Melisandre's shadow baby, which is maybe the craziest Game of Thrones ever got. But to very little surprise, the highlight of this episode was everything with Tyrion and King's Landing. After Joffrey torments Sansa, Tyrion saves her and he puts everyone in their place. This is the Tyrion that I love, the one that can verbally spar with anyone. The other great Tyrion moment in this episode is when he blackmails Lancel for sleeping with Cersei. God, I miss this Tyrion. Overall, a really solid episode that highlighted the minds of our main characters and the brutality of Westeros. Number 41. Lord Snow. Season 1 is so good that it took 32 episodes until the first episode of Season 1 showed up. This episode is the episode that really expands the scope of the show. We get to see Daenerys really start to adapt into her new role with the Dothraki, hinting at her character development later on. Ned arrives down south and we meet the entirety of the Small Council. Every character here is so well developed, but this episode alone doesn't develop them all. Introducing them is still great. Small Council scenes are scenes that I love, and this episode has the first Small Council scene. There are some other great scenes with Ned in this episode, like his conversations with Arya. The plot really begins to move forward with Kat's investigation into who tried to kill Bran. Littlefinger probably gets the most development in this episode, and it's done so great. Jon arrives at the Wall, and we meet an entirety of new characters. Again, most of these characters are great, but this episode only has time to just introduce them. And that's the theme of this episode. It sets up so many great characters that become great characters in the following few episodes. Number 40. Walk of Punishment. This episode has a lot of dark shit in it that is mixed with a few moments of levity. The moments of levity are actually quite funny. First, there is the scene at the Small Council. I don't know why, but having the scene begin without a single line of dialogue and people just moving chairs around was so entertaining. This was the real Game of Thrones, or the Game of Chairs, I guess. Then there's the scene with Robb's grandfather's funeral, and the show's insistence at making fun of Edmure I know annoys a lot of book fans, but I sure enjoy it. So we have these moments of levity, and now we can contrast that with the darker aspects climax of this episode. Theon is getting chased around and is about to be raped but is saved by Ramsay. Ramsay's willingness to kill his own people to trick Theon is partially admirable but also completely psychotic. Up north we see Gilly give birth to a boy, and knowing what Craster does with boys, adds so much tension to the scene. But of course the highlight of the episode is how it ends. Jaime continues to show little bits of honor where he can with saving Brienne, but of course the episode ends with Jaime losing his hand because of it. The shock value of this moment was so intense I'll never forget it. Just like that, a character's identity has been changed forever. Walk of Punishment has some really serious character moments mixed in wonderfully with some of the lighter moments of the show. Number 39. Second Sons. This episode features the introduction of Daario Naharis. I much prefer the later actor who plays the character, but I still like the scenes here with Daenerys. This episode also has some moments with Stannis that are well done. The episode features Sam killing a White Walker, which was awesome, and there are some great moments between Arya and the Hound. But the majority of the episode surrounds the events at King's Landing, and man, this stuff is good. We get the wedding of Sansa and Tyrion, and the entire episode focuses on how much family drama there is with the Lannisters. No one is happy here, except maybe Joffrey. The wedding itself wasn't anything too special, but the party afterwards has some amazing Tyrion moments. Threatening Joffrey is always great. His little drunken comments he makes to Sansa are also quite hilarious, but it's the scene at the end that always gets me. Seeing how kind Tyrion is to a clearly frightened Sansa is one of the scenes that made me love his character. In such a cruel place, just a little bit of kindness goes a long way. This episode may be one of Tyrion's best episodes. Number 38. The Dragon and the Wolf. Putting the season 7 finale this high might piss off a lot of people, but I'll get the dumb shit out of the way. Littlefinger's death was stupid and I hated it. And yes, the meeting at the Dragon Pit is occurring because of one of the dumbest plot points in the show. But here's the reason I really enjoyed this episode. For one, I just loved seeing all these characters together in one scene. There are a fair amount of reunions, and seeing Daenerys and Cersei discuss the war I found to be really entertaining. The major reason I like this episode though is because I found it to be a really powerful cliffhanger episode. To provide some context, I didn't start watching Game of Thrones until maybe 6 months before the release of season 8, so I was able to binge the first 7 seasons in about 2 months or so. This episode was really the only cliffhanger I ever truly experienced from this show, and I thought it was a great cliffhanger. The Night King destroying a part of the wall was a great way to end the episode. Now, you would be totally right to say a cliffhanger episode can be ruined by what comes after, and yes, that is a fair point, but even if what comes after sucks, I can still appreciate a really good cliffhanger. Number 37. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. That's right, the final episode of Season 8 somehow made it all the way to the halfway point of this list. If there is one episode in Season 8 that is anywhere deserving of being called good, it would be this episode. This is the last time Game of Thrones felt like a Game of Thrones. This episode sets up some good character drama going forward, along with character moments that alone don't matter all that much but are still nice. Jaime's return I felt was handled better than most. A lot of people wanted Daenerys' anger towards Jaime to be a bigger part of the episode, but I disagree. Brienne standing up for Jaime was one of the better parts of this episode. A few scenes later, Jaime's conversation with Bran was also quite neat. The conflict between Sansa and Daenerys I don't hate. I actually think it makes sense given the positions these two women are coming from. But of course, the best parts of this episode are when the characters are just sitting around realizing how screwed they are. These slower moments are the moments that I love, and especially the moment where Brienne gets knighted is one of the best moments in the series. Wholesome moments like these are what I miss. For as slow as this episode was, it has a lot of solid character moments that I can definitely appreciate. Before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 8.1% of my viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Number 36. Mother's Mercy. The conclusion of Season 5 has a lot of highlights and some lowlights. On the lowlight front, the conclusion to the Dorne storyline is whatever. The scene between Jaime and Myrcella was honestly really well done though. Jaime just for a moment was a real father, but that was taken away from him tragically. The High Sparrow stuff in this episode is not too bad because we get Cersei's Walk of Atonement, which was a powerful scene. It's the ultimate comeuppance of Cersei's Season 5 arc. Arya killing Meryn Trant was satisfying, I guess. Stannis' defeat was terrible, I'll admit it. I think the reason this episode is as high as it is on the list is because of Jon's story. I honestly loved most of the Night's Watch stuff in Season 5, and the betrayal and murder of Jon Snow was maybe the highlight of the season. Oh, and this episode features the redemption of Theon, which was pretty good. This episode certainly has its flaws, but the great moments in the episode cannot be denied. Number 35. A Man Without Honor. This episode is a big episode for Theon, and I'm still not sure how I feel about Theon in its entirety. I see the direction of his arc, and I think it's one of the few arcs that wasn't ruined by later seasons. But when I look at all the arcs that play out in these early seasons, Theon's arc with the Greyjoys is probably towards the bottom of my enjoyment list. One thing this episode does well is leave us on the cliffhanger that Theon actually did kill Bran and Rickon. It's not revealed until the next episode that Bran and Rickon are still alive. So I really like the suspense of thinking Bran was actually dead. Down south, there are some powerful moments in King's Landing. This conversation between Tyrion and Cersei was one of the best in the season. The scene does a great job at further humanizing Cersei. Sansa gets her first period, which means she can now have kids, something that adds tension for the rest of the season. And back up north, Jaime kills one of the Karstark men, which becomes a big plot point going forward. This episode sets up a lot of arcs, has some powerful moments with Tyrion and Cersei, and features a major moment for Theon. Number 34. The King's Road. The second episode of the series features a lot of character development. Following the aftermath of Bran's fall, we get some great moments with the Starks. Jon saying goodbye, Catelyn's conversation with Cersei, and the talks within the Lannisters are all great scenes. We get some more backstory with Robert and Ned too, which is great stuff. Out east, we start to see a change in Daenerys. Instead of being a helpless slave, she takes agency and wants to learn how to please Drogo, the first steps on her journey to really becoming a Khaleesi. A major part of this episode are the events on the King's Road, and these scenes really do a great job at fleshing out the kids. This is the first time we really start to see how much of a shit Joffrey is, and it sets the stage for the conflict between the Lannisters and the Starks. The episode ends with the failed assassination attempt of Bran, which really sets the stage nicely for the rest of the season. I love how Game of Thrones takes its time to develop the characters before the plot really starts to ramp up, and this episode is a prime example of that. Number 33. Oathbreaker. This episode has some boring stuff, but the stuff up north is great. Jon is now resurrected and we see how his death has changed him. The scene where he says there was nothing after death was surprisingly powerful to me, and then his inevitable execution of Thorne and the others was a great scene. I just wish the show did a better job of following up on this darker Jon, but I can't be upset with this episode for introducing it. Bran way up north finally starts to have visions and we see the fight between Ned and Arthur Dayne. I would have loved this duel if it was set up a bit more, since it was barely mentioned up until this point, but I still love the action of the scene. Is the double sword fighting a little over the top? Yeah, probably, but it's still one of the better action set pieces in the series. Oh, and we get hints of Bran being able to manipulate the past, which sets up the Hodor reveal nicely. There's some scenes out east that I don't really care for, but going back to Vyse Dothrak was pretty cool. Down south, we get some small council scenes, which I always love, even if they don't have Tywin. This episode has very little High Sparrow and a lot of cool stuff up north, so that means I'm gonna enjoy it. Number 32. The Climb. This episode mostly features the climb to the top of the wall, and I gotta give this whole sequence credit. I thought it was done brilliantly. I like the setup in the beginning between Jon and Ygritte. Them confessing their commitment to each other was not only great development for the two, but it added so much tension during the actual climb. And then when they get to the top and embrace, it's one of the most beautiful moments of the early seasons. Down south a bit, we have the brief unification of Stannis and Arya's arcs, where Melisandre buys Gendry and meets Arya. Now this scene is kinda ruined a bit because this one moment is meant to be foreshadowing for Arya killing the Night King, but hey, the rest of the scene is still great. Down in King's Landing, we get some badass scenes with Tywin, like threatening to name Loras to the Kingsguard. Also, there's so many pretty solid moments with Tyrion, like his conversation with Cersei and him telling Sansa about their marriage. Oh, and we get some brutal torture scenes with Theon. Overall, a really good episode that's highlighted by the brilliance of the climb up the wall. Number 31. The Old Gods and the New. This episode is certainly one of the slower episodes of season 2, but that doesn't mean it's bad. What puts this episode high on the list is of course the stuff with Tywin and Arya. Having Littlefinger show up added some great tension to the scene. The riots at King's Landing were a great way to develop King's Landing further. The common people frankly have been getting screwed over quite a bit, so it was nice to see it boil over here. Oh, and the part where the Hound saves Arya was a great character moment. And lastly, we get more development for Theon as he takes Winterfell and continues to make dumb decision after dumb decision. Solid episode. No complaints. Number 30. Two Swords. This episode is quite the slow start to season 4, but there's still a lot of cool things going on. Jon is back at the wall for the first time since season 1, and his little trial, if you will, was a great scene showing Jon's honor. Most of the episode focuses on the events in King's Landing. Jaime has returned home, and he's introduced to the status quo. His father wants him to leave the Kingsguard, but of course Jaime doesn't want to. Jaime gets some good scenes with Brienne, although I find it pretty strange that they ignore the topic of Sansa, because that's the whole reason why they are back in the first place. Tyrion meets Oberyn for the first time, and I love Oberyn's introduction, along with the rest of the Dornish. The opening scene of ice being reforged into 2 swords was a pretty cool scene. Oh, and Brienne meets Margaery and Olenna, even though Brienne met Margaery all the way back in season 2. The best part of this episode is the stuff with Arya and the Hound. Arya getting her revenge and Sandor having his chicken speech was some great shit. For a slower episode, there are a lot of cool things in the episode. Number 29. Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things. This episode does so many things so well. We are introduced to Sam up north, and the bond between Jon and the other younger people in the Night's Watch grows. Down south a bit, Tyrion returns to Winterfell where he gives Bran a design for riding. I thought the juxtaposition of him helping Bran early in the episode and then getting accused of attempted murder against Bran later in the episode was great. It's obviously very easy to root for the Starks in this season, but this one plot point about Tyrion being falsely accused makes the Lannister and Stark conflict a bit more three-dimensional. Out east, Daenerys continues to grow her influence, and her gaining more power from Viserys was honestly so great to see. Now, the majority of this episode still surrounds Ned and his investigation. Him meeting Gendry was a pretty cool scene, but throughout King's Landing in this episode, there are so many great conversations. Sansa and her concerns for the future were alright, but the conversation between Ned and Arya was fantastic. It was great character development for Arya. The moment between Jory and Jaime was also great character development, and it set up their confrontation nicely in the following episode. This episode had so many great little moments, along with impactful larger moments. Number 28. Misa. This episode gets criticized for having the white savior scene, and listen, I get it. Maybe it's my own bias, but I still thought the scene was good overall. I love these moments of victory for Daenerys, where she is clearly not an insane tyrant who would gladly kill a million innocent people. Most of the episode follows the aftermath of the Red Wedding, and I love how dark the opening of the episode is. Arya having to look at her brother's decapitated body with a direwolf head is so brutal. We get a wonderful scene with Jon and Ygritte where he finally leaves and goes back to Castle Black. Davos saves Gendry, which was a good moment of development for Davos. We get some more brutal Theon scenes, which I don't love, but hey, they're well done. What puts this episode in my top 30, however, is that it has maybe the best small council scene of the entire series. Tyrion learning about the Red Wedding, Tywin putting Joffrey in his place, and then Tywin and Tyrion's following discussion makes this one of, if not the most tense and well-executed small council scenes of the series. Oh, and the scene with Sansa in the beginning was really cute. So many good moments in this episode. A truly excellent follow-up to the Red Wedding. Number 27. The Ghosts of Harrenhal. Everything going on in this episode is great. Everything except what Daenerys is up to out east, because frankly the whole Qarth storyline is pretty boring. I mentioned it earlier, but the Tywin and Arya scenes are up there with my favorite scenes in the show. Tywin questioning Arya and then Arya low-key threatening Tywin was so badass. I cannot get enough of these scenes. The episode begins with the death of Renly, and a lot of the episode focuses on the ramifications of that. We get some great development for the Tyrells. Loras mourning Renly is nice, but I really like the development for Margaery, showing her drive to rule as queen. Brienne pledges herself to Cat to find her daughters, which was huge for Brienne. It gives her agency with wanting to get revenge on Stannis, and it shows her honor with wanting to help Catelyn. The scenes at the Iron Islands are quite funny. The way everyone there disrespects Theon and makes fun of him is simply great, but it also sets up his betrayal of the Starks nicely. This need to prove himself definitely played into that, and it's great character development. Down south, we get more Season 2 Tyrion with him learning what Cersei's up to. Season 2 does a brilliant job handling all these different storylines, especially in this episode. Number 26. What is dead may never die. This episode introduces us to the Tyrells and Brienne. Brienne's introduction is great, and frankly, everything surrounding this scene with Renly is awesome. Catelyn tries to make a political alliance, and we get a glimpse of what could have been. On the Arya front, this episode features the attack on Yoren and company, and Yoren goes out like a badass. He was definitely one of the more underrated characters in the show. Up north, we get the powerful reveal that Mormont knows what Craster does with his sons. What makes this moment so powerful is again the complexity of the characters in the show. Now, while all of this is certainly great, none of it compares to how awesome Tyrion is in this episode. Tyrion playing the Game of Thrones was so damn fun to watch. Seeing his plan in action for finding out Cersei's mole was brilliant, and the scene where they take Pycelle away was also hilarious. What is dead may never die has solid moments all throughout the episode, along with one of the best sequences in Season 2. Number 25. Mockingbird. This episode has two really great parts to it, but let's discuss everything else first. Daenerys has some cool moments out east, Arya crosses someone off her list in a scene that I liked, the strategy behind the battle at the wall was cool to listen to, but none of that really matters because, again, this episode is great because of two different parts. Part 1 is Littlefinger's murder of Lysa. This moment overall was just really well built up to. I love seeing Lysa's mental state deteriorating up until this point where Littlefinger kills her. I think I like this moment a lot because it's probably the last great Sansa and Littlefinger moment in the series. The other highlight is Tyrion convincing people to be his champion. He fails to get Jaime to do it, but it was still a great scene. He fails to get Bronn to do it, but it was still a great scene. But the scene with Oberyn, man, it makes us sympathize so much with Tyrion, and Oberyn declaring he will be Tyrion's champion was so emotional. This episode has its moments, but the stuff with Littlefinger and Tyrion made the episode great. Number 24, The Dance of Dragons. So, this is the episode where Stannis loses everything. His wife, his daughter, his army, and his life in the next episode. I know a lot of people don't like the end of Stannis' story. I totally get it, but there's a strong feeling of tragedy I get from this episode. We've grown to love Shireen over the years, and the scene is just so brutal. It hurts so much to watch. This strong of a pit in my stomach means that the episode was pretty good, regardless of my pain. On the other side of the world, we get the dragon pit fight with Daenerys, and here's the first time she rides Drogon. Yeah, this whole sequence was really fun. It's another triumphant moment for Daenerys, and I like that. These two parts of the episode are easily the most important parts of the episode, but even the stuff with Dorne I kinda like. I've always liked Dorne, and we get some nice scenes with him. The Dance of Dragons was as tragic as the Dance of the Dragons itself was. And hey, this episode has to have a few extra points for referencing House of the Dragon. Number 23, Home. This episode features the return of Bran for the first time in over a season, and even though Bran's story across the series was by far the least interesting, Season 6 was the most interesting of his story. Getting to know the Three-Eyed Raven and Bran truly beginning to use his power was a part of the season I did enjoy. Moving on to Winterfell, Ramsay kills his entire family to take power in the north. This episode here turned Ramsay into the villain of the season. I can't complain. Even though Ramsay's a total dick, he is so much fun to watch on screen. This episode features the introduction of Euron, and yeah, I know book fans hate how different Euron is from his book counterpart, but I found his introduction to be quite effective. The highlight of this episode was probably Theon saying goodbye to Sansa. He completed that arc of redeeming himself, so now he needs to redeem himself to his family. Oh, and this episode ends with Jon's resurrection, which was pretty cool. I am somewhat of a Season 6 apologist, and this episode did a really good job of setting up the conflicts within Season 6. Number 22, The Door. We all know why this episode was great, but let's briefly touch on the other parts. Meereen was whatever. I did like the scenes between Jorah and Daenerys though. Her finally forgiving him was a really sweet moment. Even though Sansa is mostly annoying in these latter seasons, I did absolutely love the scene of her chastising Littlefinger. What he did, knowing who Ramsay was really cruel. And frankly, how Sansa could trust him after that, I have no clue. But we all know why this episode is so high. Because of motherfucking Hodor. Hodor, of course, wasn't a major mystery in the show, but I do really like the mysteries that the audience isn't actively thinking about. The time manipulation of Bran and that leading to Hodor losing his mind in the past and saving Bran in the present was some of the best fantasy stuff I had ever seen. Also, the whole sequence with them escaping the White Walkers and even seeing the Children of the Forest was awesome. The mixture of the action with the payoff of Hodor becoming Hodor was what made this episode so intense and so much fun to watch. But okay, I agree, the Greyjoy scene was really dumb. Number 21, The Spoils of War. I love this episode. I don't care that it's not as well written as the early seasons of the show. The training sequence between Arya and Brienne was also a sequence I liked. People can complain all they want, but I like seeing the contrast of the tallest woman in Westeros and the shortest woman in Westeros dueling it out for a bit. There's some interesting world building here with Daenerys on Dragonstone. How there are White Walker drawings on a cave in Dragonstone, I have no clue, but it was a cool scene. Daenerys chastising Tyrion for being an idiot was a scene I greatly enjoyed, even though I wish she ignored all of them and went to King's Landing anyway. But of course, the entire battle at the end was the highlight. I think the reason I love this battle so much is because it's the first time I really felt the terror of the dragons. We saw it at the end of Season 6, but they burn a bunch of slavers, who cares? Here we get that intense battle with Jaime and Bronn on the other side. The Dothraki charging alongside Daenerys was so awesome. I still wish we had another battle like this in Season 8. Yeah, this episode is from Season 7, and yeah, Season 7's problems are still present in this episode, but I don't care. I really liked it. Number 20, The Children. This episode, some may consider the last good episode of Game of Thrones, and those people are wrong, but this episode is still pretty good. Brienne fights the Hound, which was pretty badass. I love how the scene inevitably just becomes a bunch of punching Sandor in the face. Also, Arya's coldness to abandoning Sandor was great at the end. There's a lot going on up north. Jon, being the badass that he is, decides to go to the wildlings after the battle to talk to Mance, and that is interrupted by the badass that is Stannis, and this sets up the entire season 5 conflict nicely. Bran reaches the Three-Eyed Raven finally, and it's the last time we'll see him for a season and a half. The best scene in the episode was probably Cersei's outburst to Tywin. Scenes like this show how great Lena Headey was. I specifically love the moment where she confesses to her father that the rumors about her and Jaime were true. When she says, "Yes you do," that was maybe the only time in the whole series Tywin was defeated in some way. I guess except the scene where he dies, which is another great scene. Book nerds hate this scene, but I still think it's great. This episode may not be as great as some other season finales, but it's still pretty great. Number 19. The Pointy End. The aftermath of Ned Stark's arrest was so tense and so well written. Ned doesn't have much screen time in this episode, but his one scene with Varys was so well written. His conversation about actors and being ready to die was badass. First, we see how Arya and Sansa both navigate the situation. Arya is able to escape and kills her first person ever. Sansa doesn't escape, but seeing that early abuse she faces from the Lannisters was crucial for her character development. I love how this episode ends with giving the audience hope Ned can live. And then the next episode is like, nope, Robb up north declares war, and I love the scenes of him and all the Northmen together. Robb, while sometimes stupid, was really a badass, and this episode is the first time he really gets to shine. Up north, Jon fights off a White, which was pretty dope, and then out east we get the last badass scene with Drogo before he becomes sick. And the scenes with Tyrion and the Hill Tribes further highlighted my love of this character in the early seasons. For following the arrest of Ned so brilliantly, this episode manages to crack the top 20. Number 18. Valar Morghulis. What Game of Thrones does so well is keeping momentum going in the aftermath of a major event. After the Battle of the Blackwater, so much changes for our characters, especially in King's Landing. Tyrion won the battle for the Lannisters, but gets no credit for it. The Lannisters formed their alliance with the Tyrells in a court scene that was awesome. Oh, and the way Tywin enters the scene was great. Brienne kicks major ass in this episode, showing us how great of a fighter she really is. Robb gets married to Talisa, which proves to be a cataclysmic mistake. Jon fights Qhorin Halfhand in a scene that leads perfectly into season 3, and even though the stuff with Daenerys had mostly been quite boring this season, I thought the payoff with the House of the Undying was great. Oh, and seeing Drogo with little baby Rhaego was really sweet. For an episode that follows one of the best in the series, it is still pretty great on its own. Number 17. And now his watch has ended. This episode has a lot of good stuff in it, and some great stuff. A good portion of this episode is Jaime getting tortured by Locke and the others. I think this total degradation of Jaime is important for us to sympathize with him and eventually root for him later on. Down south, there are some really solid scenes. I love Cersei's conversation about the Tyrells. Cersei's always looking to cause problems, and Tywin puts her in her place because of it. Also, the moments with Sansa and Marjorie were really enjoyable. I like the little bit of scheming the two did by trying to get Sansa to marry Loras. But the reason this episode is so high on the list is because it has maybe the best Daenerys moment of the show. The way she takes the Unsullied and burns down all the slavers was some of the most badass shit I have seen in the show. I absolutely love the moment she starts speaking Valyrian and surprises the Master. I think this scene is largely responsible for all of Daenerys' fans really loving her, and I can't blame them. She was totally badass. For maybe the only time on this list, an episode was made better because of Daenerys' storyline. Number 16. The Laws of Gods and Men. The only interesting part of this episode that wasn't in King's Landing was Ramsay taking on an entire squad of Ironborn. Ramsay is psycho, but that doesn't mean he can't be badass. No one cares about Daenerys out east because everything important in this episode is happening in Westeros. Tyrion's trial, man. Is there anything else I have to say? This was maybe Peter Dinklage's most well-acted scene of the series. The pain and rage he brings from his outburst was so powerful, and this scene was probably enough for him to win the Emmy for Best Actor that year. There are some other great moments too, like Jaime bargaining for Tyrion, but none of that compares to Tyrion's trial. One of the best scenes in the show, and maybe the best scene in season 4. Not much else to say, you know how good this stuff is. Number 15. The Mountain and the Viper. Gosh, this duel at the end is so iconic. Everything about Oberyn in this scene is great. His confidence, his fighting style, his fury with Tywin, and his inevitable doom were all played out so perfectly. I really thought that Tyrion was going to get away with it this time like he did back in season 1, but he didn't, and in typical Game of Thrones fashion, my expectations were subverted. This is clearly the highlight of the episode, but the rest of the episode is still pretty great. Tyrion has a nice bonding scene with Jaime, even though what's discussed in the scene was kinda gross. This episode also actually has Sansa playing the Game of Thrones. Her arc absolutely absolutely plunges after this moment. So even if it was brief, I loved seeing Sansa manipulate others. This episode shows Jorah getting pardoned, but that pardon is also being discovered by Daenerys. Scenes like these are always hard to watch because we know Jorah is loyal to Daenerys, but I can't blame her for exiling him. Roose legitimizes Ramsay in a fairly touching scene. If you forget for a moment that Ramsay is a sick fuck, the scene is actually quite wholesome. Oh, and Arya arrives at the Eyrie in a short but funny scene. Although I feel like it still makes sense for Arya to stick with the errands, but what do I know? This episode had a lot of solid moments along with a sequence that will make your head explode. Number 14. The Wolf and the Lion. This episode is so well written, I'm disappointed in myself that it's only number 14. Yes, this episode ends with a fight between Jaime and Ned, a fight that had been so well built up for the past few episodes, but where this episode really shines for me are the multitude of smaller character moments. Tyrion and Catelyn have a brief moment together which teases the potential tension growing in Catelyn's relationship with Lysa. Then that is followed up later in the episode. The two political masterminds in Varys and Littlefinger have a conversation highlighting how dangerous both are and the respect the two have for each other. These two just highlight how dangerous King's Landing really is. And all we got were the two of them standing in a room talking. There are some funny scenes with Ned and Robert, especially with how cruel Robert is to poor Lancel Lannister. But the highlight of this episode has to be the conversation between Robert and Cersei. Game of Thrones thrives not on having good guys versus bad guy conflicts. This scene just shows the flaws between two people and how even their mutual hatred of each other can't stop a moment of vulnerability. This episode brilliantly continues to develop characters while driving the plot in interesting directions. Number 13. A Golden Crown. This episode is only the 6th episode of season 1, and there is already so much payoff. In the Eyrie, Tyrion uses his wits to get himself a trial by combat. This is maybe the only time in the series I am actively rooting for something that will hurt the Starks. Tyrion's confession scene was also hilarious. This whole sequence was the buildup of the last 2 episodes, and it was so well done. Down south, Ned finally puts all the pieces together about what Jon Arryn died for. I love how they incorporated character development for Sansa and Arya into Ned learning the truth about Joffrey. Sure, using hair color as the sole factor in determining the parentage of someone is a bit silly, but in terms of the narrative of the season, it works. And while I don't care much for her per se, I did like the entire sequence with Osha and the other wildlings and Theon being a badass. But the best part of this episode is everything out east. Viserys' downfall was so well written. After seeing the love Daenerys gets, he tries to steal the dragon eggs in a scene that is maybe Jorah's best in the entire show. And then of course Daenerys finally getting her justice and watching Viserys die was pure gold. Get it? Pure gold. Episodes like these remind me of how great season 1 is, because season 1 really is that great. Number 12. Winter is Coming. The pilot episode does a fantastic job at introducing us to what Game of Thrones is. The first episode not only shows us the mystical aspects of this show, but also how brutal it is. There are so many characters highlighted in this episode, and they all have little moments to shine through. Bran is the young boy who's really being introduced to the world for the first time. Ned Stark is this honorable man and a great father. Jon Snow is the bastard son of Ned Stark, but is still treated like he is a part of the family. The king is a bit of a goofball who is still dealing with trauma from the past. Tyrion is another goofball who has his way with words. So many great character introductions, and I probably missed a few. What more shocking way is there to end this episode than to have a brother and sister having sex and then pushing a kid out of the window to his death? Daenerys out east also has a great introduction. I love how this scene basically plays her off like she's a slave. That is a huge part of her character. The beheading of the Night's Watch boy was also critical in establishing what honor and oaths mean in Westeros. In our world, honor means nothing, but in Westeros, it means something. Winter is Coming was a fantastic pilot episode that focuses mostly on character but still got the ball moving. Number 11. Kissed by Fire. I know throughout the video I've thrown out the term best of the series or one of the best of the series quite a bit, but I may need to put the nail in the coffin and say this episode has the best scene in the show with Jaime's hot tub scene. Him recounting the events of Robert's rebellion and why he did what he did was some of the most well-written and well-directed scenes I have seen in a TV show. The amount of development Jaime gets after we learn how honorable he wants to be is truly character changing. This was the scene that really made me care for Jaime. Of course, rewatching the scene after rewatching season 8 makes me depressed, but again, that's only because of how good this moment was. The entire arc with Arya was also perfect. The little moments between Arya and Gendry afterwards are so nice. Watching scenes like this that show how deeply hurt Arya is makes me question how the writers screwed up her arc so badly in the later seasons. Maybe the best moment for Jon in these early scenes is also in this episode with him and Ygritte entering the cave. This episode has so many good moments. Jaime getting trolled by Roose Bolton was also quite funny. Tyrion's conversation with Olenna highlighted both characters nicely and progressed the story in King's Landing. This episode is also the episode where Robb kills Rickard Karstark. This episode honestly just has everything, and it's probably the best episode that doesn't feature a series-defining moment like a battle or a major character's death. Number 10. You win or you die. When the worst scene in your episode is Jon and Sam taking their vows, you know you're in for a banger episode. Okay, maybe Drogo talking about how he's going to take over Westeros is the worst scene, but it's also another badass moment. This episode has the debut of my favorite character, Tywin Lannister. His talk with Jaime tells us all we need to know about Tywin in just a few minutes. His relationship with his children, his demeanor, his views on legacy, his power, all of it. This was the perfect introduction for Tywin Lannister. Everything that happens in King's Landing is so tense and so great. This is probably the episode where I realized how truly great the show was gonna be. First, Cersei's conversation with Ned in the garden was a perfect encapsulation of who Cersei is, and she name drops the title of the show, which has to give the episode some extra points. Robert dies in this episode, and the brewing tension surrounding his death was great. The political scheming and backstabbing in this episode is just perfect. Ned plans to have Joffrey and Cersei taken into custody, but he gets betrayed in the throne room scene. And man, how good is this throne room scene? This episode was the subversion of expectations before the real subversion of expectations happened 2 episodes later. The episode is simply great, and it does a great job at developing so many characters. Number 9. The Lion and the Rose. Yeah, this episode has some fucked up Ramsay scenes, but of course the focus is everything going on at the royal wedding. I remember watching this episode and noting to myself that we are staying on this arc for much longer than we usually do, because at this point, usually we jumped back and forth from like 5 different stories. So I really like that this episode just focused on King's Landing. The episode has peak Joffrey. Jack Gleeson does a brilliant job here. Joffrey is arguably at his worst, and I think highlighting all his worst aspects right before he dies was so smart of the writers. I love all the character interactions sprinkled throughout this episode. So many of the players are all together. All the Lannisters, the Tyrells, Sansa, Brienne, God, it's so great. And of course, Joffrey's death is the highlight, but the emotional high is undercut by Tyrion being framed for the murder. The episode gave Joffrey a perfect send-off and did a great job fleshing out the remaining characters at King's Landing. Number 8. Battle of the Bastards. I don't care that this battle has moments of plot armor and isn't as tightly written as battles earlier in the series. I really just don't care because this whole sequence was so damn tense. Yeah, Rickon could have ran in zigzags, but the whole sequence of him trying to escape, getting shot after we let our guard down briefly, and then Jon facing down an army all on his own was great. The entire long shot afterwards was also perfect. One of the best running shots in the series. When I mentioned the long night way earlier in the video, I spoke about how I could forgive poor battle strategy and poor writing if the battle is at least entertaining. And I would not say this episode has bad writing or anything, but man, was it so entertaining. The sequence where they're all surrounded and the pile of dead bodies just keeps growing made for one of the most unnerving moments of the series. I could rewatch this battle any day of the week. The music, the acting, the tension, it's all great. Yeah, I think the moment where Sansa comes in with the Knights of the Vale was a bit silly, especially the whole narrative surrounding it. But again, I just don't care. The action in this battle was so great, it deserves to be my top 10. Oh, and even though the ending to the Marine conflict was a bit rushed, I did enjoy that whole sequence too. This episode has some of the best action ever put to screen on TV, and for that it absolutely deserves to be in the top 10. Number 7. Hard Home. Yeah, this episode has some pretty good scenes with Daenerys and Tyrion, and yeah, the stuff with the High Sparrow is pretty boring, but let's talk about Hard Home. I struggle between this sequence and the Battle of the Blackwater for which episode has the best action in the series. This whole sequence was perfect. It's better than the Battle of the Bastards because not once am I questioning the stuff going on, and the action is just as good. The introduction to the Army of the Dead and how creepy it is when they all attack was perfect. The moment when Jon learns you can fight a white with Valyrian steel was also perfect. I love how this wasn't even a battle. It was a total massacre. This was really the only time in the series we truly felt how dangerous the Army of the Dead was. Oh, and of course the moment where the Night King raises them all from the dead was jaw-dropping. And I want you guys to know I barely drop my mouth when watching something, but this scene made me do it. For the sake of brevity, this whole sequence was perfect, and the only reason the episode isn't higher was because the rest of the episode was just fine. Number 6. The Watchers on the Wall. We are at the point in the video where we are entering the perfect episodes. This episode is so damn good. I really wish this episode got a lot more love over Hard Home or the Battle of the Bastards because it has so many great moments. The action down at the bottom of Castle Black was perfect. I absolutely loved the filmmaking techniques they used for this part of the episode. All the duels were so tense and so well filmed. I love how this episode showed Sam being so active for once. Like he's trying to do shit instead of just hiding like his season 1 counterpart would have. The action on the wall is also great. I love all the tactics the Night's Watch used to repel the wildlings, dropping the barrels, the giant-ass chain as well. All of it was, again, great. The part where the giant charges at the gate is a moment that gives me chills every time. As awful as being a Night's Watch member is, this moment got me so hyped, it made me want to join the Night's Watch. As big and bombastic as this episode is, it's also the little moments that are just as great. Jon and Alliser talking about leading was brilliant, Sam's conversations with Aemon were brilliant, and Ygritte's death in the arms of Jon Snow. Oh my fucking god, this episode is perfect. Perfect episode. But some of the other episodes are just a bit more perfect. Number 5. Baelor. This is the episode. This is what made Game of Thrones Game of Thrones. The main character is dead in the first season. Honor didn't save him. This is not a just world. Ned Stark faced the realistic consequences of his actions, and his head was put to the sword. Many can point to the Red Wedding as the moment that really set Game of Thrones apart. You are wrong. It is this episode. I love how all episode and even the previous one, it is being built up that Ned Stark was probably going to survive. We know the trope. We know the main character can't be killed. This episode sets Robb Stark up as the boy who is going to save his father and bring justice to the world. For a second, we think the stakes here are whether or not Ned will sell out his honor for Sansa and a life on the wall. The little bitch Joffrey even begins his speech hinting that he will show mercy and let Ned live. But no amount of screaming could save Ned Stark's life. While tragic because we know he was convicted of false crimes, it doesn't matter. I love this moment. The rest of the episode is pretty great as well. There's some badass magic shit going on out east. Robb gives his badass speech after his victory. And up north, Jon has a great conversation about duty and shares getting Longclaw with his new friends. This episode is perfect and is capped off with the moment of moments. Number 4. Fire and Blood. This episode should be the textbook definition on how to end a season. It's perfect. I know I say this word a lot, but it is perfect. What this episode does so well is not only resolve the multitude of plot lines from season 1, but it ends these plot lines on such a narrative high that it changes the status quo for season 2. Jon at first tries to leave the Night's Watch, but his friends come and save him, and it completes his character arc about learning the importance of duty. That was the pinnacle of Jon's arc. Then it ends with the journey beyond the wall, a great setup for season 2. Daenerys' story ends with her fucking hatching 3 dragon eggs. All season we had been told that dragons hadn't been seen for hundreds of years, and now we have 3 of them. Seeing where Daenerys started and where she ended was so perfect. Robb Stark is named King in the North, and this really sets up the war to come in the next season brilliantly. Arya is taken by Yoren, and we now know she will be on the run for the next season. Tyrion will be sent to King's Landing to rule as Hand of the King, another great setup for season 2. Even Sansa gets set up for the second season nicely, learning that she's effectively a hostage and needs to learn how to survive in King's Landing. Perfect finale to a perfect season. But as perfect as this finale was, it's not the best season finale the show has to offer. Number 3. The Winds of Winter. I struggled mightily between this episode and Fire and Blood. This episode is great for the same reasons as Fire and Blood. It resolves so many plot points nicely, and also ends the season on such an emotional high for so many storylines that it makes us so eager to watch the next season. Of course, the highlight of this episode is the opening in King's Landing. I think most of us can agree this is the most well-crafted scene of the last 4 seasons of the show. The music is maybe the strongest it ever had been in the series. The tension of what Cersei's planning and what is going to happen with the High Sparrow is at an all-time high. The build-up to the wildfire and its subsequent explosion was brilliant. This show is known for killing off main characters, but I don't think so many of us expected so many characters to be killed off in the opening sequence of this episode. You can criticize the High Sparrow plot all you want, and trust me, I've criticized it, but you cannot deny how shocking the conclusion to the arc was. Up north, we learn the truth about Jon's parentage, something built up literally from the second episode of the show. The way the music swells into the shot of Jon and then him getting crowned king in the north was perfect. Daenerys finally decides to leave Essos and travel to Westeros. The ending shot of her fleet and the music swelling again was such an emotional high. And even though I'm not a big fan of the scene, Arya getting revenge on Walder Frey was another emotional high. This episode has so many emotional moments that its placement in the top 5 should not be disputed. Number 2. The Reigns of Castamere. Ned Stark's death was the moment that made Game of Thrones Game of Thrones. The Red Wedding is what made Game of Thrones the most popular television show of the 2010s. It really doesn't matter what happened in the rest of the episode. When you have a scene or moment that is generational, a moment that literally changes the industry, it deserves recognition for it. This episode is probably like 80% of the reason George R.R. Martin's net worth is in the 9 figures. Nothing before or after this moment in Game of Thrones ever reached the high of the Red Wedding. I am comfortable saying nothing George R.R. Martin ever writes again, nothing this franchise ever produces again will reach the high of the Red Wedding. Before I watched this show, all I knew was a few character names and that there was something called the Red Wedding. It is literally the "No, I am your father" moment for the Game of Thrones franchise. The utter shock value and terror of this moment is something that, again, is only matched maybe once a decade. I am giving myself chills as I am writing this out. It rightly deserves the moniker for the most important moment for the series' history and frankly George R.R. Martin's life. But just because it is the moment of moments, that doesn't mean it's my favorite episode of the series. Number 1. Blackwater. The perfect episode, the perfect battle, the perfect character development, the perfect moment within the battle. This whole episode is the best episode of Game of Thrones. What I love so much about this battle is that there are no good guys or bad guys. Both sides of the conflict have people we love and people we hate. The wildfire explosion was something so stunning but so well built up to for the entire season. The action in this episode is also great. We don't need overly choreographed fight scenes, just the horror of war. The character moments in this episode are also perfect. Tyrion's speech is such a highlight. Cersei's conversations with Sansa are a great insight into the mind of both characters. The Hound leaving and wanting to take Sansa with him was another great moment. I also love the build-up in the beginning of the episode. God, this episode is so perfect. I can watch this episode over and over and over again and never get bored. For one of the most entertaining and well-written battle sequences I have ever watched, Blackwater is the best episode of Game of Thrones. And that is my ranking of all 73 episodes of Game of Thrones. What do you guys think about my ranking? Did you like my ranking? Did you hate my ranking? Or was my ranking somewhere in between? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.